Nguyễn Hữu An. Nguyễn Hữu An was one of the most important North Vietnamese battlefield commanders of the Vietnam War. An was born in the Truong Yen commune in 1926. He had already fought the French in a few decisive battles under General Vuong Nguyen Giap before he faced the Americans. Like many senior People's Army of Vietnam officers, he came out of the First Indochina War with hard experience in jungle movement, ambushes, and fighting stronger enemies with fewer resources. In 1965, he commanded North Vietnamese forces during the Battle of Ia Drang, the first major clash between regular U.S. Army troops and regular North Vietnamese troops. The Americans arrived by helicopter in the Central Highlands near the Cambodian border. This was a new kind of war. Air mobility, artillery, gunships, and constant air support. But An's men were not scattered guerrillas. They were regular North Vietnamese soldiers moving through the jungle in organized units and trying to get close before American firepower could break them. The battle around Landing Zone X-Ray was brutal. North Vietnamese troops attacked again and again, sometimes getting close enough for hand-to-hand fighting. The U.S. soldiers held, but they took heavy casualties. An drew a lesson from the fight. If his men stayed far away, American artillery and aircraft could destroy them. If they got close, almost hugging the enemy, American firepower became harder to use. This idea became known as grab them by the belt. After LZ X-Ray, the fighting continued at Landing Zone Albany and the Battle of Ia Drang, where a U.S. column was ambushed while moving through the jungle. The attack was devastating. American troops were hit at close range and units were split apart. Ia Drang did not produce a simple victory for either side. Both armies claimed lessons from it. The Americans saw the power of helicopters and air support. An and the North Vietnamese saw that U.S. technology could be challenged if they forced the fight close enough. An continued rising through the North Vietnamese army and later commanded major formations. In 1975, during the final offensive, he commanded the Second Corps, which helped capture Hue and Gia Nong before moving south toward Saigon. Carlos Hathcock. Carlos Hathcock was one of the most famous snipers of the Vietnam War. He was born in Arkansas in 1942 and grew up poor, hunting in the woods from a young age. By the time he joined the Marine Corps, he was already an excellent marksman. Hathcock served as a Marine sniper in Vietnam where visibility was often terrible. Jungle, elephant grass, heat shimmer, rain, and uneven terrain could reduce a shooter's view to a few meters. A sniper team had to move slowly, avoid trails, hide its tracks, and stay still for long periods while mosquitoes, leeches, and dehydration wore them down. He became known for wearing a white feather in his bush hat. That detail should have made him easier to identify, but it became part of his legend. North Vietnamese forces reportedly put a bounty on him, and other Marines began wearing white feathers too, partly to confuse the enemy and partly out of respect. Hathcock was credited with 93 confirmed kills, though the real number may have been higher. Confirmed kills required witnesses and paperwork, which were not always possible in the jungle. Some of his missions sound almost unreal. In one famous case, Hathcock crawled for days across open ground to kill a North Vietnamese general. He moved inch by inch, covered by grass and brush, while enemy patrols passed close enough to discover him. After taking the shot, he still had to crawl back out. Another famous story says he killed an enemy sniper by firing through the man's rifle scope. Details like that are debated, as many sniper stories grow in the telling. He also made one of the longest confirmed sniper shots of the war, using a mounted .50 caliber machine gun fitted with a scope. In 1969, Hathcock was riding in an armored vehicle when it hit a mine. The explosion set the vehicle on fire. Hathcock pulled several Marines from the burning wreckage, suffering severe burns himself. He survived, but his injuries followed him for the rest of his life. Later, he helped train Marine snipers and became one of the central figures in American sniper history. Nguyễn Thị Định. Nguyễn Thị Định was one of the most important female revolutionaries of the Vietnam War. She was born in 1920 in Ben Tre province in southern Vietnam. Her political life began long before the Americans arrived in large numbers. As a young woman, she joined the anti-colonial struggle against the French, worked with revolutionary networks, and was imprisoned for her activities. By the time the Vietnam War expanded, she was already experienced, hardened, and respected. Her name became closely tied to the Jong Khoi uprising of 1960 in Ben Tre. This was a major turning point in the southern insurgency. Local communist forces and villagers rose against the South Vietnamese government, attacking outposts, seizing control in rural areas, and proving that the resistance in the South was not dead. She became associated with the so-called long-haired army, made up of women who acted as protesters, couriers, organizers, spies, and sometimes armed fighters. They could move through villages, gather information, hide supplies, and confront South Vietnamese troops in ways that men often could not. This kind of war sometimes looked like a crowd of women blocking a road, hiding guerrillas, carrying messages, or refusing to be intimidated by soldiers. That was part of the strength of the insurgency. It lived inside the population. Nguyen Thi Dien later became a senior figure in the National Liberation Front and the Communist war effort in the South. She helped represent a side of the war often missed in American accounts: the local Southern revolutionaries who were not simply outsiders from the North, but part of the struggle inside South Vietnam itself. After the war, she became one of the highest-ranking women in Vietnamese military and political life. She was later recognized as Vietnam's first female major general. Roy Benavidez. Roy Benavidez was a U.S. Army Special Forces soldier whose actions in Vietnam became one of the most extreme rescue stories of the war. He was born in Texas in 1935 to a Mexican-American family and grew up poor. He joined the Army, became a paratrooper, and later served in the Special Forces. By 1968, he was in Vietnam, where small reconnaissance teams were being sent into some of the most dangerous areas of the war. On May 2, 1968, a Special Forces team operating near the Cambodian border was surrounded by a large enemy force. The men were wounded, pinned down, and at risk of being wiped out. Benavidez heard the distress call. He was not assigned to the team. He was not even supposed to go in. But he grabbed a knife, jumped onto a helicopter, and flew into the fight. When the helicopter landed, Benavidez ran into heavy fire. He was hit almost immediately, but kept moving. He reached the trapped men, helped drag wounded soldiers toward the landing zone, and tried to organize their extraction. Then, the situation got worse. The first rescue helicopter was shot up and crashed. Benavidez survived the wreck and kept fighting. Over the next several hours, he moved through bullets, grenade, smoke, and bodies, carrying wounded men, recovering classified documents, calling in air support, and returning fire. He was shot, hit by shrapnel, clubbed, and bayoneted. At one point, he fought hand-to-hand with an enemy soldier. The fight lasted around 6 hours. By the end, he had helped save multiple men and recover the bodies of others who would otherwise have been left behind. His wounds were so severe that when the battle was over, some thought he was dead. In fact, he was placed in a body bag. According to the story, a doctor noticed movement or a sign of life just before he was taken away. Benavidez survived, though barely. For years, Benavidez did not receive the Medal of Honor because the paperwork and eyewitness evidence were incomplete. Eventually, survivors came forward, and in 1981, he was awarded the medal by President Ronald Reagan. Giang Thuy Tram. Giang Thuy Tram was a young North Vietnamese doctor whose wartime diary became one of the most powerful personal records of the Vietnam War. She was born in Hanoi in 1942 and trained as a physician. Instead of working safely in the capital, she went south to serve in the war zone. By the late 1960s, she was working as a doctor for communist forces in Quang Ngai province, one of the most violent areas of South Vietnam. She treated wounded fighters in crude clinics hidden in the jungle, often with limited medicine, poor equipment, and the constant danger of airstrikes or raids. Patients came in with gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, infections, burns, and exhaustion. In one diary entry, Tram described a day of exhaustion when 3 seriously wounded soldiers arrived at once. She spent the whole day at the operating table, working under pressure with limited supplies while the war kept moving around the clinic. Giang Thuy Tram's writing was prolific. She wrote about fear, loneliness, love, anger, duty, and the emotional cost of war. Her diary shows the war from a hidden clinic where a young doctor tried to keep wounded young people alive while the front moved around her. In 1970, Giang Thuy Tram was killed by U.S. forces. She was only 27 years old. Her diary was found by an American intelligence officer who was advised not to destroy it because it had, quote-unquote, fire in it. He kept it for decades. Eventually, the diary was returned to her family and published. It became famous in Vietnam and later abroad under the title Last Night I Dreamed of Peace. William Calley. William Calley was a young U.S. Army officer whose name became tied to one of the worst American atrocities of the Vietnam War. He was born in Florida in 1943 and was not an obvious military star. He struggled in school, moved through different jobs, and entered the Army during the Vietnam buildup. By 1968, he was a lieutenant in Charlie Company, part of the Americal Division. His unit was operating in Quang Nguy Province, an area where American troops faced mines, booby traps, and other ambushes. By early 1968, frustration and fear inside the unit were high, and morale was low. Then came March 16, 1968. Charlie Company entered the village area known to Americans as My Lai. They expected to find Viet Cong fighters. Instead, they found mostly civilians, women, children, and elderly people. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Soldiers moved through the hamlets house by house, forcing people out of shelters and bunkers. Some villagers were shot where they stood. Others were pushed toward ditches or open areas before being killed. Very few weapons were found, and there was little real enemy resistance. American soldiers shot civilians, burned homes, killed livestock, and rounded people into groups before opening fire. Calley was later accused of personally ordering and taking part in killings, including the murder of civilians gathered near an irrigation ditch. One witness later described women throwing themselves over children to protect them. Calley himself admitted that when a helicopter crew asked about helping wounded civilians, he replied that a hand grenade was the only available way to evacuate them. The massacre was initially covered up. Reports were softened, ignored, or buried, but the truth eventually came out, largely because soldiers and investigators refused to let it disappear. Calley became the only man convicted for the killings at My Lai. In 1971, he was found guilty of murdering Vietnamese civilians and sentenced to life in prison. But the sentence was quickly reduced and he served only a few years under house arrest. Hugh Thompson Jr. Hugh Thompson Jr. was an American helicopter pilot who became famous for what he did at My Lai. He was born in Georgia in 1943. Coming from a working-class family, Hugh Clowers Thompson Jr. plowed fields and later worked as an assistant for a funeral mortuary to support his family during his adolescence. He was planning on becoming a fully licensed funeral director, but felt obliged to return to military service when the Vietnam War began. On March 16, 1968, he was flying a reconnaissance mission over the My Lai area with two crewmen, Lawrence Colburn and Glenn Andreatta. From the air, Thompson saw something wrong. There were dead civilians on the ground. Wounded people were being ignored or killed. This did not look like a firefight and looked more like American soldiers massacring villagers. Thompson then radioed a message to accompanying gunships and Task Force Barker headquarters, quote, "It looks to me like there's an awful lot of unnecessary killing going on down there. Something ain't right about this. There's bodies everywhere. There's a ditch full of bodies that we saw. There's something wrong here," unquote. Thompson landed his helicopter and confronted troops on the ground. He spoke with Lieutenant William Calley near a ditch where civilians had been gathered. Thompson believed the people there were still alive and needed help. Calley told him he was only following orders. Thompson answered that the orders were wrong. At one point, he placed his helicopter between American soldiers and a group of Vietnamese civilians hiding in a bunker. Then he told his crew to cover him. If American soldiers opened fire on the civilians, Thompson wanted his crew to be ready to fire back. His crew helped evacuate civilians and reported what they had seen. Later, Andreatta spotted movement in a ditch filled with bodies and helped rescue a small child who was still alive. And in fact, Thompson's reward at first was not praise. For years, he was criticized, threatened, and treated by some as a traitor. The Army and the country were not ready to fully face what had happened at My Lai, and Thompson's testimony forced the issue into the open. Only decades later was he properly recognized. In 1998, Thompson, Colburn, and Andreatta received the Soldier's Medal for their actions. Vo Thi Thang. Vo Thi Thong was a Vietnamese revolutionary whose most famous moment came inside of a courtroom. She was born in 1945 in southern Vietnam and became involved with the communist side of the war while still young. The Tet Offensive had begun in January 1968, when communist forces launched surprise attacks across South Vietnam during the Lunar New Year holiday. For years, American and South Vietnamese officials had claimed the enemy was weakening. Then, suddenly, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces struck cities, towns, military bases, and even the U.S. Embassy compound. Saigon became one of the most dangerous places in the country, and this is the world Vo Thi Thong was operating in. In July 1968, following the Tet Offensive, the NLF tasked Thong with assassinating a suspected spy in Saigon. After failing to kill her target, she was arrested by the South Vietnamese authorities and sentenced by a military court to 20 years of hard labor in Con Dao prison. Upon receiving her sentence, Thong faced the jury and retorted, "Will your government last long enough to imprison me for 20 years?" A journalist showed up to take a photograph, and Vo Thi Thang smiled. The image became famous as the Smile of Victory. To supporters of the communist cause, it showed defiance, a young woman refusing to look broken even after the court had tried to crush her future. Vo Thi Thong was sent to prison, including the harsh prison system associated with Con Dao. She remained imprisoned until the end of the war, when communist forces took control of South Vietnam in 1975. Afterward, she became a political figure in unified Vietnam, serving in government and public roles. Vo Tao Tri. Vo Tao Tri was one of South Vietnam's most aggressive and controversial generals. He was born in 1929 and built his career in the airborne forces of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. By the early 1960s, he was already close to the center of South Vietnamese power. Coup, crackdowns, rival generals, and constant suspicion. In 1963, during the Buddhist crisis, Tri commanded forces in Hue, where protests against President Ngo Dinh Diem's government were growing. His troops helped suppress demonstrations, and his name became tied to the regime's harsh treatment of Buddhist activists. That same year, as Diem's government collapsed, Tri shifted with the coup movement that overthrew the president. That was South Vietnam's war inside the war. It was not only Saigon against Hanoi, it was generals against generals, factions inside the army, Buddhists against Catholics, and politicians trying to survive one crisis after another. Tri developed a reputation for bravery, flamboyance, and corruption. He liked the image of a battlefield commander and was known for leading from the front, sometimes flying over combat zones by helicopter. American reporters later nicknamed him the Patton of the Parrot's Beak, after his role in the Cambodian campaign. In 1970, Tri commanded South Vietnamese forces during operations into Cambodia's Parrot's Beak, a region used by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces for bases and supply routes. The campaign was meant to smash enemy sanctuaries across the border. He moved aggressively, pushed his units forward, and gave the South Vietnamese army a rare moment of confidence. At a time when many questioned whether ARVN could fight without American troops doing most of the work, Tri looked like proof that some South Vietnamese commanders could be bold and effective. But his career was never clean. In 1971, Tri was chosen to help rescue the failing South Vietnamese operation in Laos, known as Lam Son 719. Before he could take command, his helicopter crashed shortly after takeoff. He was killed at age 41. Lauri Törni. Lauri Törni was one of the strangest soldiers to end up in the Vietnam War. He was born in Finland in 1919 and first made his name during the Winter War and Continuation War against the Soviet Union. In Finland, he became known as a tough, aggressive patrol leader, the kind of officer used for raids, ambushes, and dangerous missions behind enemy lines. Near the end of the Second World War, he joined a German Waffen-SS training unit because he still saw the Soviet Union as Finland's greatest enemy. After the war, that decision made him politically toxic. He was arrested in Finland, convicted, escaped prison, was pardoned, and eventually made his way to the United States. There, he became Larry Thorne. He joined the U.S. Army, entered the Special Forces as a Green Beret, and built a new military career under an American name. He was deployed in Vietnam in 1963 to support the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. These teams worked with local forces, operated in remote areas, and carried out missions where the lines between reconnaissance, training, and combat were often blurred. During a major attack on the camp, he was wounded and earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for valor. He returned in 1965, and during Operation Shining Brass, Thorne supervised one of the first covert missions to locate enemy routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In bad weather over the mountains near Da Nang, his command helicopter vanished while another aircraft dropped off the recon team. Rescue crews found nothing. Thorne had disappeared. For decades, his remains were missing. Only many years later were they recovered and identified. Le Minh Giao. Le Minh Giao was a South Vietnamese general best known for leading one of the last major stands before the fall of Saigon. He was born in 1933 and served in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. By 1975, the war had turned decisively against South Vietnam. American combat troops were gone, U.S. aid had been reduced, and North Vietnamese forces were advancing fast. Many South Vietnamese units were collapsing or retreating. The country was shrinking by the day. Giao commanded the 18th Division, which was ordered to defend Xuan Loc, a town east of Saigon. The position mattered because it sat on a key route toward the capital. If Xuan Loc fell quickly, the road to Saigon would open. During the battle, Giao gave emotional interviews from the front, and his words were broadcast internationally. He insisted that the 18th Division would hold Xuan Loc no matter what the North Vietnamese threw at it. He reportedly said, "The communists could throw their entire army at Xuan Loc, the 18th will stand fast, and I will keep Long Con, even if they bring 2 divisions or 3 divisions." But the confidence had desperation behind it. When Associated Press reporter Peter Arnett pressed him about the hopeless situation, Giao answered, "Please tell the Americans you have seen how the 18th Division can fight and die. Now please go." By April 21st, he reportedly knew the battle was lost and expected to die before it ended. Indeed, North Vietnamese forces shifted tactics, struck around the position, and threatened to cut off the defenders. Eventually, the 18th Division was ordered to withdraw. Saigon fell soon afterward on April 30th, 1975. After the war, Le Minh Giao was captured and spent years in re-education camps. Later, he left Vietnam and lived in the United States, where he worked as a restaurant manager before retiring. Jerry Shriver. Jerry Mad Dog Shriver was one of the most legendary and mysterious American soldiers of the Vietnam War. Jerry Shriver was born on September 24, 1941, in Defuniak Springs, Florida. In 1962, at the age of 21, Shriver enlisted in the United States Army. After finishing basic training, he attended the United States Army Airborne School. He was deployed in Vietnam in 1966. He served with MACVSOG, the secret U.S. Special Operations Unit that carried out missions across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These operations were dangerous even by Vietnam standards. Small teams crossed borders, watched enemy supply routes, called in airstrikes, planted sensors, grabbed prisoners, and tried to survive in places where they were not officially supposed to be. Shriver fit that world almost too well. He was quiet, intense, and exceptionally daring. Other soldiers remembered him as a man who seemed more comfortable in the jungle than in normal life. He wore a black scarf, carried unusual weapons, and kept a German shepherd named Klaus. His nickname was Mad Dog. Shriver's method was aggressive but highly controlled. He listened for tiny signs of contact, moved through alternate trails, set security behind him, and tried to capture prisoners when possible. When surrounded, he avoided wild gunfire, used grenades to hide his team's position, and called airstrikes dangerously close, sometimes within 20 to 30 meters. In the field, Shriver developed a reputation for fearlessness. He took part in missions where small reconnaissance teams were hunted by much larger North Vietnamese forces. On several occasions, they narrowly escaped encirclement by NVA forces, aided by Shriver's tactical expertise. His reputation grew to the point that Radio Hanoi mentioned him in broadcasts, providing battle details and even announcing a $10,000 bounty on his head, equivalent to approximately $85,000 today. By the end of 1967, reports credited him with a kill count exceeding 100 enemy soldiers. On April 24, 1969, Shriver and a team of U.S. and Montagnard troops were inserted by helicopter into Kampong Cham Province, Cambodia, and immediately came under heavy fire near their initial rallying point. During the firefight, Shriver was last seen moving toward a tree line before radio contact was lost. The team was forced to evacuate without him. He was declared missing in action and later promoted in absentia to the rank of Master Sergeant. Despite subsequent search efforts, no trace of Shriver was found, and the U.S. Army issued a presumptive finding of his death in 1974.